The Winter of Red Snow, The Revolutionary War Diary of Abigail Jane Stewart. Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 1777. Reading 9. February 28th, 1778, Saturday. Sally lost her 2 top teeth, one early this morning when she bit into a biscuit, the other after she wiggled it for several hours. She kept sticking out her tongue through the space and making baby sounds, so I gave her my shoes to wear. Now she's in the barn playing with her doll and not bothering me anymore. Any time of the day or night we can hear drummers and fifers practicing. Papa calls it a confusing noise that disrupts the peace of our valley. Myself, it is like the shots of muskets and cannons I most dislike. March 1st, 1778, Sunday. Johnny is 3 months old today. He is chubby. We made pretzels as big as Papa's hands by rolling dough into strips and then bending each one as if they were the arms crossed into shoulders. We pressed salt on top of them and baked them on the bricks. When they were done, Johnny held one in his little hand and chewed on it with his gums, for he had no teeth. It snowed heavy all day. We could not see out the windows, so made do with firelight until bed. No church. March 2nd, 1778, Monday. Still snowing. I made up with Elizabeth. It is very near impossible to stay mad at someone you must look at after hour. Besides, we had to make our way together through the storm to headquarters. We took the little sleigh by ourselves, our old mare, Buttercup, pulling. General Washington was sitting by the fire in a ladder-back chair. Nearby, trying to use the light from the snowy window, sat an artist at his easel. He was sketching with charcoal the portrait of the general. Mrs. Washington slipped us each a small square of gingerbread when we passed the kitchen. "That's Charles Willson Peale," she told us. "He painted the general a few years ago after the French and Indian War, and he plans to do the other generals here. He's a captain with the Pennsylvania Brigade." I knew he was a soldier because his toes were sticking out of his shoes. March 3rd, 1778, Tuesday. Snowed all night. At 7 this morning the wind stopped. We looked out to see a pink sunrise, but in the north were black clouds moving swiftly our way. Papa said to hurry, return the laundry to headquarters before the storm arrived. Billy Lee waved at us from the kitchen where he was pouring boiling water into teapots. Several officers in the front room talked in low voices as I hurried upstairs to knock on Mrs. Washington's door. Thinking I heard an answer, I turned the knob and stepped in. A small fire blazed in the grate. She looked up from her desk under the window. A pair of spectacles were on her nose, and I opened in front of her was a Bible. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," I said, realizing she wished to be left alone. "Quite all right, dear," she said, then turned back to her desk. At that moment, Oni pushed in with apologies to the mistress and a hand on my elbow to usher me out. "Shame," she scolded me. "Lady Washington is not to be disturbed at this hour. She has devotions every morning until 9, from 8 till 9. "I'm sorry, Oni." "Hush, child, don't cry. Billy Lee says he got ginger snaps for you and sister, so come on now." I felt miserable. To be scolded in front of Mrs. Washington was something I did not intend, and though I managed not to bawl, my eyes filled with tears. Elizabeth and I stood in the kitchen to warm up and eat a cookie before the ride home. I heard boots in the hallway and men's voices, so I tried quickly to wipe my cheeks dry. Someone came beside me, offering a laced handkerchief. I looked up into the blue eyes of Pierre. He spoke in French. Then, when I didn't respond, he said to me with a heavy accent, "Are you sad, pretty one?" I said not, only stared at him, wanting to hear more of his speech, so dear was his accent. Behind him stood Elizabeth. When I saw her mad face, I curtsied and immediately helped her carry the last bag to our sleigh. We said nothing to each other on the way home. I unhitched Buttercup and led her to the barn while Elizabeth dragged the sack to our door. It was beginning to snow. When she looked at me, I realized her chin was quivering. "Abby," she said, struggling not to cry, "Pierre wasn't wearing my coat." March 4th, 1778, Wednesday. I have been trying hard to be nice to Elizabeth, for she breaks into tears every time I mention Pierre. Mama isn't cross about the cloak, but she was most upset that Beth had told so many lies. "Elizabeth Ann," she said, "no matter how good thy deed may be, if thou art dishonest along the way, that good deed will always be tainted." Elizabeth was silent when she went to bed. She stared at the ceiling until Sally fell asleep and then looked over at me by the window. I have a new candle, so there is no worry if it's going out tonight. "Pierre is handsome and clever, yes, Abby?" Yes, I nodded. I'm trying to write. Suppose he stays in America after the war, she said. He shall need a bride, will he not? What dost thou think he done with my coat? Answer me, Abigail. Well, says I, maybe Pierre gave thy coat to a soldier who did not have one. That's possible. And without being a bride, thou art nice enough and pretty enough to marry anyone you both please, Beth. She is still awake and talking, so I shall write this quickly before she asks me another question. Today Mr. Walker came by the barn while Papa was repairing one of the pens. I heard him say that a friend who lives in the Valley Creek was caught sneaking information to the British, and he's going to be hanged tomorrow. Hanged! One of our own neighbors. His poor family. The other thing I learned is that a soldier I visited, the one that had his feet amputated, had died from fever. His wife, Mrs. Kern, would not leave his side and had to be carried away in a faint. She has no family and no place to go. The army says if she does not find another soldier to marry within 3 weeks, she must leave the encampment. I'm so sad for her. Tomorrow I shall ask if she can stay with us. March 5th, 1778, Thursday. It is very cold and windy, mercury 12 degrees. Sally likes to help Papa with the milking. He carries her from the house so she shan't get her stockings wet. When I saw her plaiting Brownie's tail, I laughed out loud. It reminded me of Vogel's plaiting Baron von Steuben's pigtail, though I shall admit that Baron is slight more handsome than Brownie's rump. We spent the afternoon riding the edge of the encampment, asking for Mrs. Kern and asking the army chaplains if there had been any weddings. 2, but none with Mrs. Kern. Finally Papa drove south by Trout Creek. Here the tents were low and shabby. A woman came out to stare. She wore a cape over a ragged dress and her feet were muddy. She pointed down the row. Papa drove on, calling for Mrs. Kern. The last tent had a small fire in front where a woman warmed her hands. Papa stepped down and told us to wait. He ducked into the tent and a moment later carried out in his arms a limp Mrs. Kern. We helped her settle into the hay on the back of the wagon, Elizabeth and I on either sides to warm her. It's late now. We have made a cot by our bed upstairs for our new guest. She told us her name is Helen and that she is 16 years of age. She fell instantly asleep. When Beth and I covered her with our quilt, we noticed that Helen is soon to have a baby. March 6, 1778, Friday. Sally and I had such a quarrel this morning that Mama put us in separate corners. I was almost miserable and mad and embarrassed that our guest had heard me crying. When Ruth and Naomi came to call and invited me to slide on the river, I was bitterly angry to have to stay inside. It was a pretty day, no clouds. But just before noon, when Mama was setting bread on the table, Reverend Curry and 2 men knocked hard on our door, calling for Papa. Hurry, they cried, and Papa was off. Upon hearing their news, Mama slumped at the table and laid her head in her arms. What, we asked. Finally the terrible words, some children have fallen through the ice. I ran outside without my shawl. I ran to headquarters and passed. There, in the ice, like a broken window, was a large hole. The crowd waited on the banks in the cold shade. 2 soldiers stood wet and shivering. Others shouted to one another. When I saw Naomi and Ruth huddled together, I ran to them. They were dripping. Abby, the boys are gone. What boys? The Fitzgeralds, 5 of them gone. They were chasing us and we heard a shot. We knew not until too late that it was the ice cracking. It was shallow where we fell through, but oh, they embraced each other, weeping loudly. It was 9:30 and my candle is short. Mama went with Miss Potter, Miss Adams, and the other ladies to comfort Mrs. Fitzgerald. I shall never see Tom again. I am sorry I hated him so much. March 8th, 1778, Sunday. It rained all day. The air was warmer. Some soldiers from the Vermont Brigade were patrolling the lower end of the river. They found the bodies of Tom, Nate, Philip, Howard, and Sammy near the Beaver Dam. I'm so very sad for their mother and for their 3 littlest brothers. Helen Curtin has brought much help to our chores of laundry and ironing. She's made friends with Sally by sewing a tiny lace shawl for her doll. Helen is cheerful, but at night when the house is quiet, I hear her crying under her pillow. March 14th, 1778, Saturday. The dark wood looks green. There are buds in the orchard and our apple trees. Sisters, Helen and I ran to the road without shoes. We ran across the fields. Our feet were cold, but it felt wonderful to have the soft dirt in our toes. We ran to the crest of the hill and looked down to the valley below Mrs. Stevens' house, where General Barnum is quartered. There in rows and rows were soldiers drilling, marching, saluting, and loading muskets. Many were barefoot like us, but there were many in new uniforms, snappy blue jackets with buttons, white pants, tricorns. It was a sight. We hurried as close as we could without being seen, and hid under some dogwood bushes still bare. Baron von Steuben paced in front of the men, shouting orders in several different languages. Not one of them did we understand. There were 3 men with him, interpreting. One listened to the Baron's commands, turned to Pierre, translated them into German, then Pierre turned to Alexander Hamilton with French words, which Mr. Hamilton then shouted into English. Only then did the soldiers respond to the left drill, right drill, or whichever it was. Several times we heard Mr. Hamilton shout curse words, then shrug with embarrassment because that was what had been translated to him. Thursday, Friday, and today we hid in the dogwoods to watch the soldiers. Elizabeth's eye was on Pierre, though he has not yet shown up wearing the coat she made him. Baron von Steuben, for all his arm-waving and swearing, is proving to be a good instructor, and he's now learned enough English to curse directly at the men. His black coat comes to the top of his boots and flares out like a dress with his long strides. Azor comes to the field too, but often disappears after rabbits. I so want him to find us and play. March 16th, 1778, Monday. It has been a sunny week, no clouds, and the hills are greener each day. We can hear frogs at the creek, and I am certain I saw a robin. Yesterday we hung General Washington's shirts and such along our eastern fence to dry. I minded not so much the ironing and folding because the scent of the fresh air has now filled our house. Helen has taken up all of Mama's mending, and this morning baked a chocolate cake. She let Sally stir and lick. Mrs. Washington sent Oni to ask our help. Tomorrow is a celebration for St. Patrick's Day, and she has so many pies to bake. I'm glad she needs no eggs. March 17th, 1778, Tuesday. Sunny, breezy, cool. We stood on the hill to watch the soldiers, our shawls wrapped tight. All afternoon there were blasts from muskets and cannons mixed with rising puffs and smoke. The trills of fifes and steady rat-a-tat-tat of drums made for a most festive mood. I hoped to see a drummer boy wearing the shirt I made. After drills, the soldier began a game called Long Bullet, where they piled cannonballs in a heap, then stood back. With another ball, they took turns seeing who could roll the longest and hardest and knock down the most. We went in to help Mama with chores. Then we began, before sundown, returned to our hiding spot. There was the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, playing catch with his officers. This turned into a game of wickets, using bent twigs poked into the ground for tiny gates. The ball they batted around was probably like the one we made Johnny out of deer hide. I wonder if we were still at war. Such was the sound of men's laughter and music. This is St. Patrick's Day, but who is St. Patrick? March 18th, 1778, Wednesday. When we woke again to the drums and fifes, I thought the soldiers were still celebrating. But on coming downstairs and hurrying through our breakfast, we realized the drum beat was slower. I wanted not to go outside. If another woman was being drummed out of the army, I would feel worse than if it were a man. I would know not why, but I would. Later, Papa reported it had been an officer, for perjury and other offenses. March 20th, 1778, Friday. Sunshine all yesterday and today, more buds on the trees, but not quite blossoms. We hiked to the creek, Elizabeth, Helen, Sally, and I, and found our secret pool. It is shallow with a sandy bottom, and it is in the sun most of the day. It is not as icy as the running river. Shrieking with cold, we stripped down to our bare skin, jumped in heads under, and then in an instant we jumped out to dry ourselves with our skirts. We sat on the banks to let our sun dry our hair. Helen is smiling more. She knows not when the baby will be born, but the size of her belly seems to say soon. March 21st, 1778, Saturday. Such a dark storm moving in this morning so swiftly. Sally and I heard the thunder while milking and quickly finished. We ran from the barn to the house in a blow-down downpour, spilling much from our bucket. It rained hard all day. What we can see from the road from our windows is a river of mud. In the distance was the sound of drums and fifes. Why are the men drilling even in the rain? I asked Papa. He said von Steuben promised General Washington that he would turn our soldiers into an army, and that is precisely what he's doing, Abby. March 23rd, 1778, Monday. Still dark and rainy. We had to go to headquarters, as Monday is always wash day, rain or not. Such mud for a poor wagon. Helen came with me, as Elizabeth is feverish and coughing. Mrs. Washington and Mrs. Knox were in the kitchen. Mrs. Knox is so round, I think she too is expecting a baby. They insisted we dry off before returning outside, to become soaked yet again. I was sitting on a little stool by the kettle, my face and hands to the fire, when I felt something wet poke my side. I turned to see Azor, his nose now on my lap and wagging his tail. "Hello, boy." I petted him behind his ears and hugged his neck. When my hand felt the cloth on his back, I could not believe mine eyes. Azor was wearing Elizabeth's coat. The sleeves had been pulled up over his front paws, and it was a short waistcoat as it buttoned under his belly. Elizabeth's coat fit Azor. It is late. The laundry is hanging through the house, still damp, and we girls are upstairs in our nightgowns. Elizabeth is shivering with fever. I have not the heart to tell her about Azor's new clothes. March 24th, 1778, Tuesday. As it is still raining, we are late returning to the General's laundry. All morning we used hot irons with the hopes of drying things faster. It was almost at supper time before we drove to headquarters. Papa covered the top of the wagon in planks of wood from the barn to keep the clothes dry underneath. There in the parlor with Mr. Washington was von Steuben and Pierre and Alexander Hamilton, all speaking in a cheerful mixture of English and French. And there by the fire of Azor, having himself a nap, snug in his handsome blue coat. What am I to tell Elizabeth? March 27th, 1778, Friday. Finally the storm broke. It has been sunny, with just a few clouds in the afternoons bringing light rain. Thus the roads were still muddy. I was in the barn loft playing dolls with Sally when Papa came in the small door with a neighbor. When they began to speak in low voices, I put my finger to Sally's lips, then mine, for they knew not we were discreetly above them. "Why did you kill him?" Papa asked. Sally and I looked at each other wide-eyed, not daring to breathe. "General Wayne told me to." "A general told you to kill one of his men? Come on now, this makes no sense." "'Tis true. Every morning this same soldier has been coming into my barn and stealing a chicken, every morning for a week, Edward. I reported it to General Wayne. He was sitting at a table writing a letter and could not look up at me. Finally I asked the general. I said, 'What shall I do?' General Wayne dipped his pen into the inkwell, kept writing. Without looking at me, he said, 'Oh, just shoot him.'" I could see through the crack on the floor that Papa's shoulders sagged and that he was shaking his head in a soft voice. He said, "So thou shot the poor fellow?" There were several moments of silence. "Yes," said the man. "He's buried in my south fence. No one knows but thee." The rest of the day Papa was quiet. Sally and I spoke not about what we had heard.